Hello, my name is Paul DeWitt, and on behalf of the Oral History Project of the Nashville Bar Association Historical Committee, I have the honor today of interviewing longtime Nashville attorney David Parker. David has practiced law in Nashville for many years, and prior to that, practiced in other cities and towns across our state. And I would begin by asking him to state his date and place of birth.
David Young Parker, born March 21st, 1941, in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Welcome to the Oral History Project, Mr. Parker. So glad to have you with us
Thank
today.
you, thank you.
And you are at present a member of the Nashville Bar Association,
I am.
Tennessee Bar Association,
I am.
American Bar Association.
Not the American Bar.
All right. We'll get into that, but tell us a little bit about your early years growing up in, I believe, Chattanooga, Tennessee, what your parents did.
I grew up in a neighborhood called Highland Park. And Highland Park was in the inner city, but I didn't know it. I didn't realize that. And we grew up in an old frame house. It was built in 1904. And we lived right across the alley from my daddy's drugstore. And we lived there from 1943 until, well, I went off to college in 1959. And, but my daddy's drugstore was the center of the neighborhood. Everything that happened, you went through that store.
What was the name of his store?
Willow Pharmacy.
And it was, as was common in those days, kind of a family-owned business?
It was. We had, my brother and I worked in there. My mother didn't. One day, I remember one day my mother helped out down at the drugstore, but that did not really go very well. Not that anything bad, she just didn't really know what to do. But my brother and I both worked in the drugstore, and my brother was the oldest, and so he caught the brunt of that. And I was the little brother. But
what was your older brother's name?
Robin.
I see. And your parents' names?
My father's name was Arthur Harry Parker. And my mother's name was Sarah Tittle Parker.
And your mother, I believe, was a strict...
My mother was a very strict disciplinarian. And I got my spiritual training from my mother. And and while my father was also that, but I got I guess my common sense growing up training through my dad.
Was your mother a very conversant with the Bible?
Yes, she was. It's one of the funny things about that was, from my earliest remembrances, you know, one thing I grew up in the Church of Christ, right. And one thing they had on Sunday nights, they had what they call a young people's class, and that started 30 or 40 minutes before the evening service. And the way it was, we were there every day. Every time the doors opened, we were there. And so, but my mother would write my little talks out. And I remember my little stick men she would do, and I learned to lead singing in that thing. And so what they did, they had the boys stand up, and you made a little talk. You learned to lead a prayer. You learned to lead the songs and stuff like that.
And you attended the grammar and junior high and high schools of Chattanooga?
Yes,
What schools did you attend?
I went to Highland Park Elementary School, and I went there for grades 1 through 5. And then I went, there was a place called Chattanooga Bible School, which was operated by members of the Church of Christ, that I went from the 6th grade through the 8th. But after that, I came and I went to the 9th grade at Eastside Junior High School. And then I went to high school at Chattanooga High School over across town on East 3rd Street.
And I believe there were 2 main high schools in Chattanooga at that time.
There were 2 main high schools, Chattanooga High School and...
Tell us a little bit about their character.
Okay. Over in the neighborhood in which I grew up, we sort of grew up in the shadow of Central High School. And Central High was the people from Central called City High School the City School, because it was sort of the college preparatory school. Central was the football school. And so you would go out there, and people that graduated from Central, especially those who played football, were very loyal to it. And in my dad's drugstore on Saturday mornings, these men, as long as they could get in their leather jackets, they would come in there in those high school Central leather jackets.
Those were the days when there was great pride in your local high school, and especially your football team and the Letter jacket was a very prominent.
And it was something, and you know, today you see a lot of what you call fake letter jackets.
Right.
School letters were very strictly controlled in those days. And if you had a school letter, if you earned one, you were something else.
You were something to be very proud of.
And one thing, of course, you followed high school football in our neighborhood, and especially Central, because we were just down the street from where they were. And they had to finally make City and Central quit playing because the riots started, the fights. And
between the students?
Between the students. And one day, Chattanooga Central used to play Bradley County. It's up at Cleveland. And I think they stopped that rivalry in 1953 because the Central boys threw one of the boys through the plate glass window downtown.
Oh my gosh! Wow. Anyway, so you went to City High School, as it's called.
I went to Chattanooga High School, and I started there in August of 1956.
And graduated
in May of 1959.
Any particular fond or nostalgic memories of?
Yes, I had. Well, fond memories. One thing, the school was so big. You had little pockets of friends and groups of things like that. And in my homeroom, there were fellows in there that I knew. And one of the hardest things, though, was ROTC. ROTC was required at both City and Central in those days. And I remember when my mother took me over to City High School in August of 1956, and we had to get fitted for our uniforms, and all like they were fitted. They gave them to you, and you had to try to do what you did with them. And so, and then my first sergeant was a fellow named Sidney Carpenter. And Sid made things miserable for
really old school tough.
Old school stuff. And Sid was brilliant. He eventually ended up going to the Wharton School of Finance at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was a National Merit Scholar, and then he went to law school at Vanderbilt. Well, anyway, I dreaded fourth period ROTC. And not so much because of what it was, but it was the way Sid treated you. And we would get out there, and one day, one thing you learned to do, we had to learn to march. And sometimes when you think that you know how to march, well, you don't until you learn to keep in step. Well, when we would do a company mass turn, that meant the fellow on the inside had to half step it, and the man on the outside had to double step it. Well, I remember we were doing that one day, and I was on the inside, and Sid was right in my ear. He was just half step it in there, half step it in there, and he was, you know, and all of a sudden I felt this hand grab me right over here on the side of my, and pull me out of range. And I looked up there, and he got me over and looked up, and he was glaring down at me.
Oh my God.
And he was standing there, you know, and I'm 15 years old. And so he looked down there, and he says that my belt buckle had a P on it. And he says, "What does that P stand for, pissant?" I said, "No, Parker." And well, he got, you know, where you just dreaded going. But he was a tough guy. One thing you learned was that when you if you were absent one day, everybody learned all three of your names. And Sid would call that roll and all. And I'll skip ahead just a little bit here. After, of course, Sid went ahead up as a senior, and I was a junior. Well, so when I started,
he was just a little bit older.
Oh, he was just 1 year older.
Oh, he wasn't a grown adult.
Oh, no, he was just a student.
I see.
And Sid would, the next time I ran into him was in August or September of 1963. And I was at Vanderbilt Law School, and I walked in the snack bar one day, and there sat Sid Carpenter.
Totally unexpected.
Totally unexpected. He had these horn-rimmed glasses and brown bag in it. And I went over and I said, "Sid, I know you're not going to remember me." But I told him what he did to me when I was in school. Well, it really embarrassed him. He felt, he said, "I'm so sorry. I am so sorry."
So he was a law student at Vanderbilt.
Oh, he was a law student, yeah. And brilliant student, just brilliant person.
Where did he go
Well,
to practice law?
Sid came to Chattanooga, went to Chattanooga to practice law.
Is that right?
And did quite well, but the problem was he eventually lost his mind because he, you know, and he got into a fight with one of the partners in one of the law firms out in the middle of the street. And then one of the big firms sort of brought him back, and but he was always very good to me in school now. I mean, after that, up in the law school.
Well, anyway, so you You graduated in the spring of '59, and then from there enrolled at.
I left high school and I went to David Lipscomb College here in
Tell us,
Nashville.
how did you come to choose David Lipscomb?
Okay,
Or
all
did you-
right,
were you
all right.
one
This
that
comes,
even chose that?
well, I did not choose that. That was
Chosen for you.
by my mother. And mother, I could go to school, college at two places. I could either go to University of Chattanooga, which was privately owned in those days, or I could come to Lipscomb. Now, a little bit more about my mother. My mother believed in the biblical injunction of teaching the Bible to you from the time you got up in the morning to the time you went to bed at night, and she did. And we would, she had very strict
You
rules.
describe her as a fundamentalist.
She was a
believed in the
fundamentalist.
literal truth of the Bible.
And what we couldn't do, we couldn't play with what she called spot cards. These are playing cards, and also because it might lead you to gambling, and that might lead you to sin. And you couldn't go dancing. You couldn't do that. We couldn't go in what they call mixed swimming. We could, and of course, that was the only life I knew.
Right.
And one of the worst things, well, not worst, but surprising things. So I would go across the street and play cards at the boy's house across the street. Well, one day, it was summer day, we were over there, and he had 2 decks of playing cards. And I had a 10 of clubs, and I put it in my pocket, and I forgot it was there, and I went home. Well, you know how boys do at high school. You take your shirts off and you leave them, and your mama gets them the next day and washes them and all that. Well, I came home the next afternoon, and my mother met me at the door, and she was crying. And she says, "How could you?" And I said, "Mama, what is it? How could you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She held that card out here. And it says, "You know, I do everything I can to raise you right, and you go out and you do something like this, well, you would have thought I'd robbed the bank." And but she was,
Real old school.
oh, she was.
discipline.
She was very old school about
So
that.
she had her mind set on you going to David Lipscomb.
Well, she did, and I mean, and so it didn't bother me. I mean, that was fine. And
what was Lipscomb like in those
Lipscomb was like a big church in those days. And when you came, and there were kids from all over the country came there, but most of them were members of the Church of Christ. And you had Bible every day. And here again, they had very strict rules for what you lived by. Well, that didn't bother me because that's what I was used to. Right. But Lipscomb was a good school. And
what did you major in there?
well, I started out in pre-med because I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I didn't know why, but my dad was a pharmacist. My first cousin was the pathologist and all this, and so I thought that's what I was going to do. Well, I had college algebra, chemistry, and biology all that first quarter, and I didn't do real well. And so in December, I go home, and my brother was a senior at Auburn. And we sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at me and said, "Well, little brother, it looks like you do better in law subjects than you do in medical subjects." I said, "All right, I've got to do something." And so I came back to Nashville and changed my major to business administration, where I should have been to begin with, and went over to Vanderbilt to find out what you had to have to get in. And that's what I did for the next 3.5 years.
Oh, so you in your freshman year at Lipscomb first gave thought to becoming a lawyer?
Yes, because see what it was, I knew I had to do something, and neither my brother and I wanted to be pharmacists because we thought you'd have to work too hard. But of course, later you found out what that was like, and so I wanted to my mother and dad. I wanted to please them, and so I worked just like an animal all the way through school.
Was your father supportive of you becoming a lawyer?
He was.
He wasn't insisting that you
He
take over the family.
Oh no, I think he would like for us to, and they were always very supportive. They wanted me to get a good education. I graduated from college and law school with no debt. They paid my way all the way through, and but very supportive because my daddy was a country boy, and came from a little place called Cedar Bluff, Alabama.
Is that right?
And he never got out of high school till he was 22 years old because they had to work. And so when he came, my dad never said much to me. He, like I said, a country boy, but boy, he cut those eyes at you. And all he had to do was look at me, and I had the message. And now Daddy as he said, he didn't put up with any foolishness in the drugstore. And I noticed when we came in here, a pinball machine. Well, I always wanted to have a pinball machine in the drugstore. Well, no, he wouldn't, because he said all the people would do was just hang out and loaf. Yeah. And then my mother grew up, was born in Chattanooga on East 5th Street, But her daddy died when in 1921, and mother was 9 years old. And so my grandmother ran boarding houses over the various parts of the state. And mother eventually went to high school at a place in Senatobia, Mississippi.
Is that right?
And
Did your family travel around the South much?
no, because see, one thing about owning a store, like anybody who owns a family store, you worked all the time. We worked from 7:30 in the morning to 11:30 at night.
So you had very little time to venture away from.
And we took some family vacations at first. I remember we went to Florida, and we went to Washington. And the last family vacation we took was in 1953, and we went to St. Louis to see the Cardinals and the Dodgers play ball.
You were a baseball fan.
Oh, well, listen, every boy was a baseball fan, and that is, of course, carried over to, I used to have a lot of baseball uniforms in my office on 2nd Avenue.
In those days, well, I guess still, the Chattanooga Lookouts were a minor league team there.
The Lookouts were a minor league team, and one of my cousins sold box seat tickets.
Oh, really?
So I always went to the games, and he would slip me a box seat ticket, and I'd go in and sit down in there. And Chattanooga had some good players like Harmon Killebrew and people like that.
What was the name of the stadium that they played?
Ingalls Stadium. Ingalls Stadium.
All right. Well, but back to college, and you graduated, I guess, in 1963.
1963.
Was it then known as David Lipscomb?
It was. It was David Lipscomb College now.
Not yet a university.
That's right. Now, I am a group of what they call diehards. It's still David Lipscomb College to me. And I remember sitting next to Gary Gober in Vanderbilt. Gary and I sat next to each other for 3 years. And Gary had gone to Harvard, and that real simple ring, and all it said was Harvard College. And but I always put down that I went to David Lipscomb College. And
so then upon graduating there, you had applied to and been accepted at Vanderbilt Law School?
I had applied to that. And
was that your first choice of law school?
Yes, and it was really my only choice. I went over there. I remember I had to take the LSAT test twice. And because I got the first thing back, and I went to see Dean Beasley. Now, the lawyers in town who are my age will remember Dean Beasley.
What was his first name?
John S. Beasley II. And Dean Beasley asked me, he said, well, did you finish the test? And I said, no. I tried to get everything right. He says, wrong, go back and take it again. And I don't care if you eeny, meeny, miny, moe 'em. Finish all, and I passed. I got enough to start.
Who do you recall among some of your professors at Vanderbilt Law School as having the most influence over you and your fellow students?
I think one who had a lot of influence over me was Elliot Cheatham. And Mr. Cheatham had graduated from the University of Georgia in 1907. And
1907?
1907. And
this was the 1963.
And Mr. Cheatham went to Harvard Law School, and he taught at Columbia for years. Back in those days, Vanderbilt would hire the Ivy League professors because they all had to retire at 65. So we had Eddie Morgan, people like that.
Famous professors.
Famous professors. And one thing I noticed, though, that had an impression on me, when I still remember the first week there, we had a course called, it was an initiation week kind of, and all, and it was very, very difficult. They were very hard on you. And we had to stand up and recite and all, and we went 6 days a week. Well, they gave you more work than you could ever get done, like typical law school thing. But then we had a fellow named Ray Patterson who taught contracts. Now, one teacher I really enjoyed was John Wade.
Dean Wade.
Dean Wade, and he taught torts, and he had a way. He never had much personality outside of the classroom. Because I remember walking by him one day, and if you'd gone to a place like Lipscomb and then you came to Vanderbilt, you was just almost begging for somebody to talk to you. And I walked up to Dean Wade, and he just looked at me. I was trying to say hello, trying to be nice to him, you know. But they used to call Dean Wade the Cobra.
Where did he get the name?
Well, he was kind of stoop-shouldered. He was on Iwo Jima, and he was kind of stoop-shouldered, and so you know how students are, so they called him the Cobra. And then we had one professor named Paul Hartman. Sure. They called Hartman the Dutchman. And he was hard on us. And then one professor I really remember that I liked was James C. Kirby Jr. We called him Mr. Kirby. And Mr. Kirby taught civil procedure. And one day we were going to have to stand up and recite in there. And we had a case on assumption. Well, I looked and looked and looked to try to get that in my mind, but I couldn't. So when I walked into class that day, a boy named Phil Wilson from Kentucky sat to my left. And I said, Phil, if he calls on me, I'm going to pass out. Well, what you would do in those days, everybody would keep their heads down so they wouldn't call on you. Well, right off the bat, Mr. Kirby says, Mr. Parker, will you give us this case? And Phil said,
this is a case on assumption.
On assumption. And he said, are you going to pass out or what? And I got up. Well, I was so flustered. And Mr. Kirby was good to you. And as you know, one thing we were always taught at first was that you never could trust anybody. You couldn't. And you didn't believe anybody. And they would tell you, for example, you don't need to know the names of the parties to a case. If you're asked, don't do that. It could be Willie or Zilch. So we got in there and I stumbled around. And so Mr. Kirby finally said, all right, Mr. Parker. I couldn't do it. He said, would you please just tell us the names of the parties to this? And I said, the plaintiff and the defendant. Well,
the plaintiff and the
defendant. He started laughing. Well, the boys and stuff in there, they started scraping their feet and hissing. And I'm standing up there in front of that. And Mr. Kirby was laughing so hard, he finally said, Mr. Parker, just sit down, please.
Oh, that's great. Who were some of your classmates that you?
Well, now, all right, I sat next to Gary Gober for 3 years. All 3 years we were there. And then Bushkin, the bombastic Bushkin, Henry I. Bushkin, who became Johnny Carson's lawyer, was in our class. And now I have a photographic memory, and I can tell you where everybody sat. And I remember back there where Bushkin sat. And we had them. And now Warner Bass was in my class. And let's see, Warner. And when we didn't have all that many Nashville boys in there because Vanderbilt was trying to become a nationwide law school, national law school. But Warner was, I remember Warner. And now another one was Lionel Barrett. Lionel Barrett Jr. was in my class. Frank Woods was in my class. And Sissy Daughtry was in my class.
I see.
And
was she one of the very few women students?
We didn't have, but there were 3 women in each class.
Wow.
And Sissy was had gone on the three planes. She was really a year younger than we were.
You graduated in the spring of 1966.
Yes.
And took the bar that summer, I believe.
Yes.
Where did you take the bar?
We took the bar at Vanderbilt. And what we had, now Tom Peebles taught the bar review course, and we took it there. And most of the fellows, I was married then, and most of the fellows' wives went home, went somewhere, and so the fellows stayed around there, you know. And one interesting thing about taking the bar, we had a fellow named Pat Arnold. Pat was a captain in the Marine Corps.
Arnold?
A-R-N-O-U-L-T, Arnold. And Pat was from Memphis. And here he was, a captain in the Marine Corps, and he really looked out after everybody, sort of. It's funny how it was. Well, the night before the bar exam, I went over to Kentucky Fried Chicken on West End Avenue and got some fried chicken. Well, as luck would have it, I got a bone caught in my throat. Oh, no. Well, I panicked because what happened was if you didn't take the bar exam then, you couldn't take it till a good month later. Well, I went in there and I was shook. And so Pat was sitting in there working, and I told him what was wrong. He said, go buy a loaf of bread and start eating that bread. And what it'll do, it'll get rid of that bone in your throat. Oh. And when it did, boy, it was gone. And but Pat was university boxing champion at Notre Dame, and he, like I said, he was captain of the Marine Corps and all.
Well, so you passed the bar?
I passed the bar.
At that time, did you have a job?
Yes, I did. I had a job to start in Chattanooga at Hall, Haynes, Lusk, and Foster in August.
How did you come to them, or had you clerked or interned?
Well, what we did in those days, they prepared a little booklet. And the booklet had everybody's picture in there, and it told you had a biographical sketch. And Dean Wade had written an opening. He says, here's our graduates, and we recommend every one of them. Said we are, we have a very tough regiment over here.
This was a booklet to be circulated.
Circulated, and I got this call from this law firm in Chattanooga, which was Hall Hanks. Now, probably the reason I did, George Foster, who was the youngest partner in that firm, George graduated in the famous class of 1957 at Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt class of
57, and George finished number 3 in his class. And of course, Jim Neal finished first, and Abby finished second. And George played chess with Jim. And so they contacted me, and I went down there and interviewed with them. And I know one day I got a letter from them. They hired me, and I was so surprised. I was very pleased, that I had been. And now, one thing though, I clerked the summer of '65 in Chattanooga.
For that firm?
No, I clerked for Leonard R. Tanner Jr. Now,
Father of the tennis player.
Mr. Tanner taught Roscoe to serve a tennis ball like he practiced law. He was a tough disciplinarian. And so what I did was, one day I was in Mr. Tanner's office, and I was sharpening the pencils, and I was seated behind his desk working, do stuff. And about the time Mr. Tanner walked in, he looked at me, he says, "What are you doing behind my desk?" "Well, sir, I'm taking care of you like I'm supposed to." He said, "Can you imagine what somebody would think a client would if they walked and saw you behind my desk?" I said, "Well, I don't think it would be bad or something like that." Well, he didn't agree with that. And he taught me 2 more lessons. He came in one day, and I was sharpening pencils. He says, "Look, son, do you know what it costs me to support my family?" Well, I thought I was going to be a tax lawyer, and I had worked on his estimate. And I said, "Yes, sir." And he says, "Well, I have a rule. If I make my first $100 every day, I don't do anything like you're doing." And then he taught me too. He said, "Don't you ever go into the afternoon chasing your overhead. You make it in the mornings." And
good lessons.
Good lessons and all. And so, but I learned a lot from him. And I remember when Roscoe would come up. Roscoe was in about the 11th grade. And would come up,
his son,
the tennis player, and he was now we had another fella in there. Mr. Tanner was Mr. John was Mr. Tanner's law partner, and Mr. Tanner was the Frogman, which was the forerunner of the Navy SEALs. And one day I was in Mr. John's office, and he said, "David, I can swim 15 miles in the ocean." I said, "How do you do it?" He said, "That's my secret."
Interesting. Anyway, so after passing the bar in the summer of 1966, you worked for
Hall Haynes. I started there on August 1st, 1966.
And you didn't make it too far.
No, I didn't go very far.
I'll
tell you about that. No, I don't mind. I started there, and they put me in this little broom closet office. I mean, it was so small. But then I had to buy my own office furniture, all of that stuff. They gave me, they did my letterhead, provided that, and they provided secretarial service, and they started me at $450 a month, plus 50% of everything I brought in, which was nothing. And so I had that. Well, they had a client called Jim Walter Corporation, and George Foster ran all the titles for him. Well, we made $25 a title, no matter if you had to drive 100 miles to run it. That's all you got. Well, I was busy doing that.
Going into courthouses.
And that was one of the things it was. Now, you would go in, like, for example, up at Marion County at Jasper. And when I'd go up there, George would say, now, David, let me tell you what, you'll walk in there. And he said, "What you up here for?" And I'll tell him, the title's good. But he said, "David, you've got to run that title. Don't you?"
You didn't trust the local.
Well, it sure is no, but when you got through, it was good. He said, and the registrar would say, "Well, what did I tell you?" And so you ran them there, went down to North Georgia, North Alabama, ran them there and all. And but one thing, we didn't have public defenders in Chattanooga in those days. So they appointed you to cases.
To
represent. Once they were indicted, that's when you got appointed, because this was right after the days after Gideon and all those. So I tried the case, went all the way to the Supreme Court, first one. And it was West versus State, and went up there, and my man had been charged with, he was arrested, and Church was charged with vagrancy. Well, he was charged, but they arrested him because he had burglarized the tire service company there in North Chattanooga. Well, I got in the case and I filed a motion to suppress. And my argument was he may have been a burglar, but he's not a vagrant. And you knew that, and you got all the evidence off of him when he was charged with vagrancy. Well, that caused no little bit of commotion and consternation. And so I argued that we tried the case, and of course I lost, and which you all did. You lost all of those.
The jury trial?
Yeah, it was a jury trial. And so when I filed this motion for a new trial, and Judge Grant was on the bench, and he said, Mr. Parker, you may sit down now. And I said, but Your Honor, I'm not through. I'm trying to protect my client's constitutional rights. He says, you've already more than protected him. Please sit down. Well, I got my case ready, and I went to the Supreme Court. And Bob Hedgepath was on the other side up here in Nashville. With
the State Attorney General.
State Attorney General's office. Jerry Summers, who is now quite famous as a criminal lawyer, was the assistant DA down in Chattanooga.
Is that right?
Well, all the judges on the Supreme Court in those days were old enough to be my grandfather just about. Hamilton Burnett was the Chief Justice. And my man had beggar lice. He was all these beggar lice found on him. And Bob, beggar lice, they called it. And because he walked through the fields and got on him. And Bob didn't know what they were. So Judge Burnett looked down at him and said, son, have you ever been off the sidewalk in your life?
Saying this to the assistant
Attorney General up there, so I argued the case. Well, I was just sure I was right. I mean, I was right on the money. And I lost, but in the opinion, he said, this has caused us much concern, pro and con, about this case, what you wrote. Well, then when they came out and they printed, some of the, I call better criminal lawyers got in touch with me and said, you're right. But what they said was, it doesn't make any difference what we charge him with, the arrest was valid, which I didn't agree with.
The original charge was vagrancy.
Vagrancy.
And they seized evidence.
All the evidence came off when he was charged with vagrancy. Yeah. But it was good. I had one young lady I had to represent, and she was charged with feloniously escaping the workhouse. And she was a pretty little thing. So I went up to the jail to interview her, and I said, why did you do this? Well, she was ironing over at the workhouse. And she said, I just wanted to go home. So I walked out the door and went home.
Like the door was open?
Door was open. Then I had one where we had State of Tennessee versus Bobby Wayne Gifford. And up at the jail, he was charged with forgery. And I went up there to interview him. Now, one of the first times I went, one of the partners, Jack Lusk, had been at the DA's office, and Corey Smith, who was the former DA, was there. And I walked in, and Mr. Lusk said, David, what did he tell you? And I started, he said, all right, let me tell you this. Mr. Lusk held up one hand. He's, all right, first of all, he's a Christian, lived all these different things. I said, Mr. Lusk, how did you know? And they just horse laughed, and that's what they all say. So.
Nothing's much changed, by the way.
Nothing much changed. Well, anyway, Bobby Wayne Gifford was charged with forgery. Well, and we called it take low and go. I don't know what y'all call it now. We'll take low and go. And so Bobby was willing to. And take the low thing. And now one thing too, the so-called career criminals knew the law better than the lawyers did. And so Bobby, the longer he was in jail, the better looking he got. And I said, you're looking better every day. He said, well, Mr. Parker, I've been drinking moonshine since I was 16 years old.
He was drinking it in jail?
No, he couldn't get to it. And anyway, what happened was he ran the canteen.
At the jail?
At the jail. And so we got over, and Jerry Summers and I worked out a deal where he'd plead guilty if he could stay at the county jail and run the canteen. Well, the rule was, though, once you got convicted, you had to go to Station A up here. And so Jerry and I went in to see Judge Grant, and Sheriff Evatt had wanted it done. So Judge Grant comes out the courtroom, takes the plea, and he said, well, we're going to make an exception here. We understand this man runs the canteen. And of course, he wanted to stay in the jail because he was better off there. Now, one man was there, Mickey Barker's dad was a detective. Mickey Barker, who's former Supreme Court Justice.
Yeah, Justice Barker.
Yeah, Justice Barker. Mickey and I grew up 2 blocks from each other.
Is that right? In the
Highland Park area. And his mother and then his family traded with my dad at the drugstore. And Mickey's dad was one of the detectives in the sheriff's department up there. One day we walked in, it was after school, and walked in over there, and they had just confiscated all this moonshine. Well, it was in these plastic jugs, and it was up and down the hallways in the courthouse. You could smell it a half a block away. And his dad had been in on getting that.
Well, you practiced law there with that firm in Chattanooga.
Well, I practiced there, but anyway, after, you can tell, you can sort of feel when something's happening. So my first child was born on February 12, 1967. And they called me in, and about 2 weeks later, late one afternoon, they said, about 2:30 really, and it says, David, we need to talk. And I went in there, and there were two of the partners, and they said, we're going to have to terminate our relationship. Well, I was scared to death. I mean, I didn't weigh but 150 pounds. And I was sitting there, and I mean, back then, see, to get fired was a mark of shame. I mean, you just didn't. And so I sat there, and I said, can I have another chance? They said, no. And they said, David, and Mr. Luss, who went to the University of Virginia, said, David, don't they teach you at Vanderbilt what you're good at? He says, now, you're a very good criminal lawyer, you're very good at this and that, but says, you'll never be a partner in this law firm. Well, and all. So it hurt my feelings, obviously. It killed me. And back then, you wouldn't talk about it. But I went to work at a place called Provident Life and Accident Insurance Company. Provident Life. There were three major life insurance companies in Chattanooga. They were all family owned. And the McClellan family owned the Provident. Well, I learned to handle large sums of money. And I thought I was wasting my time, but I didn't realize that. Well, then I didn't think I was a real lawyer, so I got in touch with Vanderbilt, and they talked about there was an opening at the State Welfare Department and the Legal Department. So one of my former classmates, Aubrey Blankenship, was the general counsel, and I came up here and interviewed and was hired.
As a staff attorney?
Staff attorney. But what?
Around child support litigation?
We didn't do child support litigation. What we did, we tried dependency and neglect cases, child abuse cases, and welfare fraud and paternity suits.
This was the predecessor of the Department of Human
That
Services.
is correct.
It's been known as the Department of
And there weren't but three of us at first to cover the whole 95 counties. And one of the persons there was Patricia Eves, who had been Miss Tennessee in 1957. And she was a head major at University of Tennessee. Well, we had to cover those things. But before I came up there, my dad took me aside and said, son, you need to get more aggressive. And there was this old man who raked leaves down the street from my mother and daddy's house. And he told me, he said, you'd make a better preacher than a lawyer, So anyway, when Daddy told me I need to get more aggressive, well, I tell you what, you got aggressive.
You had to be to
it was
prosecute those.
A lot of people think, I thought when I went there that juvenile court was just like sitting around holding hands and coming up with ideas to work everything out. But it was a very dangerous job. And especially when you got up in rural areas and people...
Because you're threatening families.
You are threatening families, and they let you know it. And we would get these threats where they would threaten us, we're going to kill you if you come up here, Then you learned you didn't worry about them so much as the nuts. I had one case where we ran up against the Grand Dragoness of the Klan up in Sevier County.
And where?
Sevier County.
Sevier County.
I took the hardest cases because I thought I had to, because I'd been fired and I had to keep my job. Well, we had one up there in Sevier County, and I just knew I was going to get killed. In fact, we tried it the week after we walked on the moon.
1969.
And I would go up there and I would count three before I turned on my ignition, because I was afraid it was going to blow up.
Oh, wow.
And anyway, we got up there, and it was a hot day. It was horribly hot. And the lady who worked for the welfare department was a deputy sheriff, and real short little named Lydia Boer. She's dead now. And she wore that pistol on her hip. And so the day it came to try the case, I got there, and it was a hot summer day. Well, the TM Wynn, Lawrence and Sevierville, TM came into court that day with a big Panama hat and a striped suit and white shoes. He came over to me, and anyway, when I walked in up there, the courthouse was full. I mean, people were everywhere. And the sheriff, who's cross-eyed, looked at me. He says, he was involved in hauling liquor. And he said, Mr. Parker, don't we know each other? I says, no, I do not know you, and you don't want to know me. Well, anyway, T.M. Wynn came in. And we were all waiting on the Grand Dragoness to come in. And he said, David, Tildy, that's what they called her. Tildy thinks she's pregnant. Now, she was 55. At my age of that day, I thought that was ancient. Yeah. And so she didn't come in. He said, but here's the catch to it, David. Y'all got to go get the kids. We're not going to turn them over to you. So Lydia, where she hopped in that car and took out, and
this is the
deputy sheriff went up there to get them. But
a rural house or something.
Yes, and then, you know, I had them, some of my hardest cases were up in Upper East Tennessee, at Johnson City, and places like that. And that was, and then also in West Tennessee. I remember going to McNairy County, and which was not a particularly pleasant place to go.
Those were the days when I guess Sheriff
Pusser was around. And then we had, I had one case I remember, we tried it up in Scott County. Oneida. We tried them in Huntsville because that was the county seat. Oh, yeah. Well, this it was a paternity suit because see, a woman had to agree to cooperate with the state on AFDC to recover those things. So we got up there to try the case. Well, we tried it in front of a jury in about March, and a boy named Charlie Martin was the lawyer on the other side from Oneida, and we had for example, we had a bassinet where this man had bought the bassinet for him, you know, and even part of our testimony was he had patted the woman on the stomach and said, "Don't worry, honey, we'll make a home for this baby." Well, we tried the case and broke for lunch, and this lawyer from Oneida came in and said, "You're going to lose this case." We said, "How can you say that?" Well, 3 men on the jury have illegitimate children, and they're afraid you're going to come after them. Well, we filed a motion based on the judge's 13th juror, and and so I argued the thing, and the judge brought us up there after, and he said, "I'm not going to rule right now. Wait till the jury term's over, then I'll rule." Of course, he granted the motion. Well, we tried it in November 1969. Well, Charlie got over there, and he argued. He got up and said, "I have never seen anything so ridiculous in all my life. Is this man, they come all the way up here from Nashville, Tennessee to prosecute my poor old John Archie Foster. Yeah. Mr. Parker's in an office where the carpet's up to his knees. They're so..." And
where have I heard that argument before?
Where I heard that argument before. Well, anyway.
State and its vast resources.
Vast resources.
Usually is you.
It was it. And so I was driving this 1969 Plymouth Fury, yeah, and it would run like the wind. I mean, it was. So we won. And I come driving down out of Scott County, coming down toward the interstate. And back then, of course, you couldn't pick up the local news till you got down there. Well, that was the night Governor Clement got killed.
Oh, yeah.
Franklin, and he was governor. And he pulled out on Franklin Road, and I heard about it about the time I got to Lebanon, because you could pick it up. And but you learned a lot in those cases, and so.
So you worked as a lawyer for the Department of Welfare.
3 years. I did that for 3 years, and then
a lot of cases.
I tried a lot of them, and one thing we had a little saying: you either come back carrying your shield or on top of it. You better not run. And so, and some of them were, boy, I ran into some buzzsaws up in Greene County. I mean, they were, you know, and this is kind of amusing, but one of the funniest things was Pat Eves was supposed to try a case up at Carthage one hot summer day. Patricia Eves, Miss Tennessee. Well, I walked in that morning. She got me to go in her place, and there stood Jackie Beller and Chancellor Turner. And the first thing they said, "Where's Miss Tennessee?" And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, here I am." So we've been waiting all week for her to come. And Jackie was the guardian ad litem, and he cleaned my plow. I mean, gosh, he was mad.
So you left, I believe you went to Genesco.
I went to work for Genesco as a corporate lawyer in the corporate law office.
Where were they were out
on Murfreesboro? No, we were on 7th Avenue.
Oh, the 7th Avenue.
111th, 7th Avenue North.
Right.
And I started there. Now, when you've been trying cases 2 or 3 a day, and all of a sudden you walk in a corporate law department and you're not, it gets boring really quick.
Yeah.
So I ended up doing I got a collection to work on. And I got all the money in on it. And it gets in your blood. And I got to doing another one. I got very good at it. Well, they sent me to New York to the Garment District. And
Genesco wanted you to collect debts?
I collected debts. I went down into the Garment District, and I got good at that. And I know one we had where I had to go to North Caldwell, New Jersey. And I would start out down and go down there. And so I lived at a place called at 54th and 6th in the Dorset Hotel. And so the day we were going to go, that was 1975. That's another place I thought I was going to get killed. And I waited. It was a hot July day. And 1974, excuse me. So this big black flagship limousine came down in front of the hotel, and that was there to get me, to take me over to North Caldwell, New Jersey. Well, I had an undercover man. And what had happened was a Genesco salesman had sold $600,000 worth of inventory on open account to settle a gambling debt. So we got over there, and we walked in, and we didn't have electric door locks in those days down here, but you did in New York. Well, the first door we came to was an electric door lock. And we went in, and he had 6 soldiers out in this hallway, this mafia man. It was organized crime was into all of the businesses, garment business. So he had these soldiers, I remember they had enough oil in their hair to change your car oil almost. And their faces were rough. And then went through another door. And went in, here was this, I call him, I guess he wanted a Don. He was not that high up, but he was a consigliere or whatever he was. And he had this aging secretary over here, sat over there. And anyway, we walked in, and my man, we sat down. And finally, I told him, we talked, he told a few jokes at first. Then I said, well, I told him while I was there, I said, you owe my client money. He says, yes, we do. And I said, well, I need to pick it up today. I came here to get the money. Not today. And I said, well, I need to get a note from you. He's okay, that's fine. He never raised his voice. He was very nice. And so then I said, all right, now how about security? We need to get some security. He says, no. And I said, why? He said, because we don't do things like that. And about the time the undercover man came over and whispered in my ear, he says, let's go. Once he tells you he'll pay you, he will pay you. And it's time to leave. Well, we got outside, and he said, I didn't tell you this for him, but he pulled a pistol out of his briefcase. And
Your security guy.
My security guy. And so we crossed back the river back into Manhattan. And I was so glad to get back, and I was on 34 years old. And I remember they let me out down on 23rd Street there in Manhattan. And see, where Genesco's world headquarters are at 35th Avenue. So I had to walk all the way from there back up there. And I never rode the subway or bus anywhere. I walked. And so then the next thing, one of the best things I thought I did up there, I did the Ralph Lauren deal for Genesco.
What was that?
That was, he was heavily in debt to Genesco. And
the designer?
The designer, yeah. And so it took 2 months of negotiation to do it. He had 5 Jewish lawyers representing him to my one Camelite for Genesco. Well, we got in there, and the negotiations were at a loggerheads. So one afternoon, his lead lawyer's name was Larry. And I said, Larry, can you tell me the 12 sons of Jacob?
The 12 sons.
The 12 sons of Jacob. He says, no, can you? And I named them the order of their birth and their mother, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. He said, where did you learn that? I said, my mother.
Your mother's strict biblical training.
Paid off, and it totally changed the course of what happened. Well, I would work with all Jewish law firms in New York on various things. And so that knowledge of the Old Testament, and most of the firms, the Orthodox lawyers were very knowledgeable about their background, but the others weren't. And so, I remember the day we signed the papers, Ralph Lauren came in. I was 34 and he was 32 years old. And he came in, he had a high temper. and he had driven his left hand through the window pane of a door, and so that left hand was all bandaged up in there. And one of the men I would work.
He was angry about having to.
He was angry about something, and but he wasn't used to being treated that way. But he owed so much money to Genesco, and but I worked for a man named Edward Francis Carney. Now, Mr. Carney was the number 5 man in Genesco in those days. So he would be up there at 730 Fifth Avenue, and I would go out, and I would come back in. One day I'd collected $800,000. Wow. And I came back in, but he would always ask me, I'd come in there, and he had that Irish smile. Boy, he was Irish Catholic. And he would ask me, we get through, he said, "If you had enough to eat?" And of course, the way it was, and those of us in the service areas didn't make a lot. He always made certain I had plenty of food to eat, and that meant a lot to me. He looked out for me.
Did you develop kind of a mean streak, or had to?
Yes, I had to, I had to, because one day we were up there. I was doing something, and we were fighting this man, not physically, but we were fighting. He asked me one. He said, "Parker, what does it take to stop you?" And I said, "Kill me." And he says, "You're not serious, are you?" I said, "You absolutely. If you think I'm leaving here without what I came for, you're going to have to kill me. I'm not going to dishonor myself." I said, "I've been fired once." And I didn't tell him that, but I knew that. And so, and then here's something you had up there. Once they knew you had the power and you were willing to use it, they respected you. But you had to learn this too. If you walked in there like there was not enough mustard in New York to cover you, then your days wouldn't be long. And when I came back from there, there's some lawyers I've worked with here in Tennessee and across places who have acted not the nicest in the world. And I've told some of them sometimes, I said, the way you act, your life expectancy in the garment district would be about a day.
So you were able to collect a lot of that?
I did. I collected a lot of it, and yeah.
Later on, you went into private practice, and they were one of your clients.
They came to me and hired me to travel for them. And so I would travel, you go in unannounced, and I ran into some pretty difficult places there. And so I remember I had to go to Indianapolis, and the fellow that I was sent to, the last man who had been to see him, he had broken a stool over his head. And I went in, and he was kind of crazy, and all. But you had to do that, and then you learn how to run a shoe store. I had one fellow up in Sparta, and I went up to see him. This is when I was in private practice, and he was in debt to Genesco for a good bit of money. So I went in there, and I said, "You know what your problem is? You don't know how to run a shoe store." So we started, and I told him he was selling boots cheap boots to farmers and guaranteeing them. The expensive boots were on the wall. They wouldn't pay for those. They got the cheap ones.
So you knew the retail end of the business too?
Right? I did. We had a fella out in Green Hills. I won't tell you the name of the thing. But he owed money, and it was a very upscale business. So I went out there to see him one day, and I told him that while I was there, you always went in unannounced. And I told him, well, he said, "I don't have the money." I said, "You're eating, aren't you?" He says, "Yeah." He said, "You want part of my food?" I said, "You're right. I want half of it."
He was taken aback.
He was taken aback, and he paid.
He paid?
And but
so you after a few years working in Genesco's corporate department, went back into private practice, I believe,
in Lafayette. I went up in
Lafayette up here in
Macon County. And when you're coming off the streets of New York to a place like that, and I practiced law with a man named James Chamberlain. And so I worked up there for about 3 years. And then I came back to Nashville. And one thing that helped me, I had a lot of good contacts. And so when I opened my own office by myself.
Where in Nashville did you open?
First American Center on the 13th floor.
Solo practice?
Solo practice. And well, one of the reasons why I was too old to go to work for any large firm. And so I went, and Richard Chambers over at Nashville City Bank gave me an $8,000 line of credit, and I took $4,000 down. Well, my secretary and I would sit at the desk on Friday afternoon and pay the bills. We got that $4,000 paid off.
Which caused you to develop a really good relationship with
Richard. Richard was a very good friend of mine, and we worked hard, and I worked like an animal. I worked, and my secretary worked that way. She was 10 years older than me, and that was very good for me. And we did that. And
who were some of your clients there?
Okay, of course, Genesco, then the Crystal Company, and I'll tell you how I got the Crystal Company.
Crystal Hamburg.
Crystal Hamburgers. It was owned by the Davenport family. And I went over, and the man who ran it for the Davenport family went to church where I did in Chattanooga. Well, he was my mother and dad's age, and he would call me all the time. He said, "Will you do me a favor and run an errand for me?" Well, I would do it like a good little boy. So in June of '78, I come back from the courthouse, and my secretary said, "There's a man named Mr. Sawyers in Chattanooga calling you." I said, "I know what it is, another errand for nothing, but I'm going to do it." So I called him, and this soft voice said, "This is Frank Sawyers." And I said, "Mr. Sawyers, you asked me to call you." "Yes, sir." He said, "How would you like to start representing the Crystal Company?" I think I can work that in to my...
Wow.
What
kind of work did you do?
Well, what they wanted was, he said, "Here's one thing. David, you're street smart, and you're mean, and that's exactly what we're looking for." He said, "We have this big labor firm down in Atlanta, and we send stuff down there for them to ask them a question. Can we do this?" And 4 days later, they write us a letter and says, "No, you can't do that." He says, "Hell, son, we knew that before we sent it down there."
We didn't need to hire
All right, you tell us how to do it. Yeah. Well, you learned that every restaurant is a store, and how they did it. They counted every hamburger patty. If there's something was missing, they knew it. Well, one day I got this phone call about 4 o'clock in the morning from the district manager of Crystal. And he called me and he said, "David," he said, "there's a big fight at the Crystal out on Charlotte Avenue. They're throwing ketchup and stuff at 4 in the morning. Now, what do we do?" And I asked him. Then we got through. He laughed. He said, "I hope you don't mind us calling you at 4 o'clock in the morning." "Not at all. That's why I'm here." She said, "Because you bet if you aren't here at 4 o'clock, we won't be here at 9 o'clock.
There you go.
Well, then I got International Telephone Company. That was down in West Tennessee, and I was trying workers' comp cases, and I always made the remark about the chief check writer. That's who you had to talk to. And so they came to me in February of 1984, and they wanted me to try one case, a heart attack case. And so they said, "Now, do you understand that, are you okay with just getting one case? Because we have other lawyers." And I said, "Yes, sir, that'd be fine." So finally we got through, and this old white-headed man was in the office, and they said, "You talk about the chief check writer." And I said, "Yes, sir. This is the treasurer of International Telephone Company. They own a place called, what was it? I'll think of it in a minute." But anyway, so he looked down at me and he said, "I want to talk to you about your fees." I said, "Well, okay, sir." I was full of bravado. And he talked about it. I said, "Well, first of all, sir, I'll tell you, everything in this office is paid for. We paid cash. We paid for everything going in there, so it's paid for, down at 135 2nd Avenue North." And so I said, "First of all, I want you to know that. And secondly, I'd like to have your business. But you'll know if I don't get your business, I won't miss any meals tonight." He said, "Son, you're hired. That's what we want." International Telephone Company. Well, so I went down. My first trip down there was March the 20th, 1984, on a Thursday. Well, I walked in. I thought I was going to get one case. So I walked in, and the industrial relations manager threw this letter over his desk. Said, "Look, read that letter." And the letter was from their local lawyer who got his nose out of joint because they took that one case away from him. And all I was going to get was one case. And the man said, "You know what? You're going to get every one of our cases." We had to have a dolly to roll them out. File after file after file. They rolled them out there and put them in that car, and I brought them back to Nashville.
These are workers' comp?
Workers' comp cases. And but they were unionized down there. See, Genesco wasn't unionized, but they were down there. Well, then I got that. Then I got Little Debbie. Snack cakes. I got that one. Then I went on to another one and another one. And what happened is sort of like a domino effect. If you got this and you got that, one. And so it did. Then I stayed in First American Center until 1981.
And moved.
We moved. I got to buying into buildings on Second Avenue.
What was Second Avenue, the real estate market like?
Okay, the real estate market, nobody wanted it. It was, we were down there, and it was still like Sanders down there with their big trucks lined up. Kennedy Hardware was down there. You know, it was a industrial area. Well, what happened was a fellow named Frank Ryan, who was a CPA, Tongate and Ryan and stuff, and then the Dukes brothers and all. Well, they made me, told me about the buildings and stuff, and so we went in and bought, the first building we bought was 176.
Second Avenue.
Second Avenue North. And that was in 1980. And well, first they bought it in 79, then they put the partnership together. Well, it was a lonely place down there then because all the other, there's just no lawyers down there.
You bought it with the intention of moving your law.
I did, and so I made I moved down there.
You actually were in there.
I was in 1981, June of 81. Well, one Sunday morning, I couldn't, we were having to be there to meet some workers. Well, Bill Willis walks down the street. And he talked to me. That did me more good. He was so nice to me. And I thought, boy, here's a man of the stature of Bill Willis talking to me. And so he stopped and he visited and stuff like that and talked with me, And so we were pioneers down there.
Did he move down there around that?
He was back up. He was up
here at 215.
215 is where he was. He was very helpful.
He was one of the
early ones down there. And then I was there, and I ended up, I was teaching business law part-time at Lipscomb over there. And I got a lot of business from students, from their fathers and stuff like that.
Who were some of the clients you got?
Well, a Nashville Sash and Door Company. And I had the two of the boys over there, and so
the McAllister family, I believe.
Yeah, and so this one was there was a man who was chairman of the board at Lipscomb, one of the partners, and then with the two McAllister brothers, they owned Sash and Door. Well, the McAllister brothers eventually bought this, and I'll think a senior moment. And so one day we were sitting up there, and I got this call from the credit man down at Sash and Door, and he said, "I'm bringing you all these cases up here to work on." Well, Tom McMean was the partner. Well, John, who was one of my students, I get this phone call. He says, "Mr. Parker," he says, "Robert Chandler's coming up here with these cases. He thinks he's bringing them, but they're coming from Daddy." Is where they come. So we got started, and Mr. Sidney McAllister, Joel McAllister and Sidney. Jack McAllister and Sidney. Sidney was very good to me, and he really, we had a wonderful relationship down there. And then I got a lot of work from Nashville City Bank.
Oh, yeah, Richard Chambers.
Richard Chambers, it came through there, and that worked well. And so I guess I finally got to, rolling fairly well.
And you bought buildings?
We bought, all right, when we got down there, nobody wanted them. So I remember Frank Ryan, who sort of spearheaded. Frank was sitting there one day, and he said, everybody, I've been wandering around these buildings. Everybody thinks I'm crazy. Old Frank's crazy. And so what happened was I never bought until there's one, but I never bought an interest in the building I didn't have cash for. And I always had paid cash for mine. Okay. Yes, I did. And I was always afraid I was going to run out of money. And so I was very careful with things. And so the first one was 176. The next one was 144 building. But what we didn't know was you look and see how you can picture it done. And but it was a whole lot harder to rehab the buildings than it's cheaper to take from the ground up. Well, the building you're in, Washington Square. Well, Anthony Ansaldo did that building. Ansaldo, Tony Ansaldo. He came up, and what you see is a Washington Square building. He did that. That work was done around.
The building we're in now had been Washington
Manufacturing Company. And so, and Tony did it, but he was too many years ahead of his time.
When did he do that? In the late 70s?
In the early 80s, something like that. And he went broke. and he lost the building and all. One thing that was happening on 2nd Avenue down there, for example, there was this really nice little cafeteria in the basement of one of the buildings.
Right.
But it was there too early. And
I think I remember it. Carter's, maybe?
it may have been down there.
That.
Well, then we got into we bought the 144 building.
Yeah.
Then we bought the 114 building. That's the owners down there used to, you know, by numbers. Like, for example, if you had owned a building down there, the owners called them by one. You had 114. The address. That was what you called it by. And so now down at 176. Bobby Matthews, that's the older Bobby Matthews and I, we had sort of a love-hate relationship because we're next door to each other. And one day I came in and he was sandblasting the brick, and my office looked like a tomb. Had dirt all in it and stuff like that, you know. We got that cleared up and all. But I know one thing, when the San Antonio Taco opened up on Commerce, now Richard Chambers came up to me one day and he said, David, Richard, go down there. He says, if I look in that place and I see some of my bankers drinking beer, they won't be working for me at 1 o'clock. He was tough about that. And that reminds me of a place in New York, this Mr. Carney that I worked for.
With Genesco?
At Genesco. We ate lunch at Larry's one day. That's a French name, Larry, on 55th Street. And so he said, now, David said, could I buy you something to drink and lunch? I said, no, sir, I don't drink. He says, you better be glad you didn't take that drink because you wouldn't be working for me if you did. And, but Richard was there. So anyway, I had the whole 4th floor of the 176 building. Well, there was a man who was renting some space from the people who rented from me. And I walked by there one day. He had a whiskey bottle on his desk. He was a retired Army officer. And I went up there to the people he was renting. I said, get rid of that whiskey bottle. I said, if Jimmy Webb or Richard Chambers walked over here and saw that whiskey bottle, that would not be very pleasant. And so, but I had a good relationship with the National City Bank and enjoyed it. And then you made a lot of friends down there. And
who were some of the other lawyers down there?
Well, the Cheadles came.
Right.
The Cheadles
John
came in
Cheadle.
1983.
Right.
And John Cheadle Sr., I remember the day I met him.
Right.
And he was a typical Texan. He was very outspoken. And so I asked him one day, I said, John, what brought you to Nashville? Play football at Vanderbilt.
Right.
And he said, I was the captain of the team. Didn't you know that? I said, no. He said, well, I was. And he said, I was one of the last 60-minute men that played out there, you know.
Is that right? Yeah.
But one thing he told me, he said, he and John Jr. owned the building together.
Right.
John owned Jr. owned half and John Sr. He said, but my half's paid for. But he was a good guy. I mean,
Yeah.
really good.
I knew Mr. Cheadle. His children and I went to school together, John Jr. and Evelina.
Evelina, and Evelina's my buddy. I mean, she is, and she was her daddy's favorite.
Yeah.
And
They
then,
used to have a trampoline in their backyard over on, I think, South Bellevue. We used to go over there and jump on it.
And
Neighborhood center back there.
doing that, and then they were. I'm trying to think.
Who were, just speaking of lawyers in Nashville, were there any senior members of the bar that you looked up to?
Oh, well, one of them was your daddy.
Well,
One of them was your daddy, and because see, especially when I got out of school, see, Bassbury and Simpson had about 8 or 9 lawyers. None of the firms did.
Had more than 9 or 10 of those.
They were up there in the American Trust Building,
Right.
where they were. So I looked up, and one of them, I tell you, was Charlie Warfield.
Right.
And
Ferris Warfield.
Ferris Warfield, Canada. And Charlie, one Wednesday afternoon, his secretary, Mary Cooper, called up at the office at the state. I was with the state then. And said, is there a David Parker up there? And I said, well, you were talking to him. And she said, well, this is Mary Cooper at Charlie Warfield. I said, oh, I'm sorry. I mean, you know, she said, oh, no, that's all right. And so Charlie, and we had a case, we tried the case in juvenile court and went up in front of Benson Trimble. Well, Bill Rutherford was on the other side of the case. Well, I was trying to be so fair for the state's lawyer, not to be fair to this, not to be fair to that. So we took a break, and Charlie Warfield got over there and got down in my face. He says, look, I know you're trying to be fair. He said, but we're going to lose if you don't help me. Well, we were up there, and I was up at the lectern. You know how it was, well, Judge Trimble's court. Well, Bill Rutherford was sitting down here on the right. Well, we had really been at it. I mean, he got strong. And so my books fell off. I couldn't help it. They fell down on top of Bill. Bill got up with that fist back. He was getting ready to hit me.
And, a real slam banger.
Oh, real slam banger. And you know, Judge Trimble had a court officer, and he had a little stick. And if you got to talking in there, he'd take that thing and rap you on the head. Pat, 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 pat. And Charlie and I were talking, you know, about that. And then, of course, Charlie, Mr. Harbison. I had a lot of respect for Judge Harbison.
Just William Harbison.
William Harbison.
Tennessee Supreme Court.
But the lawyer that taught me more procedure was Lewis Farrell Jr.
Lewis Farrell Jr.
Oh, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. Now, I had a case where I was representing this company this man here in Nashville, and I sued what became Lewis's client under the long arm statute over in Chancery Court in Sumner County. Well, Lewis taught me some things. First of all, Lewis would write you letters that were so trenchant and so strong, you'd almost have a heart attack when you opened it. And when I was a much younger lawyer, I would react to them. That wasn't smart. And I learned to lay them aside for a few hours or a day, and then they weren't nearly as bad.
Right.
Well, Lewis had that way of just absolutely, and what he did, he sent me to Lynn, Massachusetts to do the discovery. I had,
Boston.
yeah, they had this request for production of documents. He said, you can have them, but you got to go to Boston to get them. And I went up there, and somebody told me before I left, said, you know what you're going to find them? They're going to be down in the, Jack Madden told me. He said, David, you're going to find them in the basement of this old dark place. Sure enough, that's exactly where they were. I went down in there, you know. But Lewis, and I beat Lewis in this case over in front of Chancellor Turner.
In Gallatin?
Gallatin, and on this long arm case. But anyway, though, I made a settlement demand on Lewis. And he came back, and he offered me $2,500. All that incensed me. Lewis said, son, that's a lot of money. That is a whole lot of money. But we tried the case. So after it was over, I called him one day. And I was trying to be nice. He said, look, David, you beat me. Do you have to rub it in? Young Lewis. And so my secretary used to tell me, you mistreat me, I'm going to hire Lewis Farrell Jr. I'm going to sue you.
Well, those were the days when there were many fine senior members of the bar who...
Well, Jack Madden was one. Jack Madden was, they called him Crazy Horse because he, you know, but one thing Jack did, I'd sit there over at Gracie Madden, and a man would call Jack. He was the most gracious person. And he said, oh, well, he said, may I have some extra time? I said, well, certainly, certainly. And he was really nice. I mean, and I learned something there. He you know, and Jack was a tough guy. Yeah. I mean, he was a...
Hugh Gracie was a well...
Hugh Gracie was one. Well, Mr. Gracie called me over to his office one day. This was after I opened my office, and Don Binkley and I were doing a lot of stuff together. He was a partner at Gracie Madden. Well, Mr. Gracie called me over to his office, and then he was a frail little fella. He was really, really getting on up in years. And he said, son, what you going to do with the rest of your life? I said, well, sir, I'm going to work. I've got my family to support. He said, well, would you come over here with us? And I said, well, I just opened my own office. This was in the summer of 1978. I just got open. Well, he says, he told me what you know, he was wanting, and, you know, and I couldn't do that. But I ended up working with Mickey Miller and a bunch of them. I really liked Mickey.
Yeah,
and fine lawyer. Well, Don Binkley would pick at my stuff. We'd be working on something. He'd take a pencil and pick at it. Well, it wasn't until Don died that I found he was a newspaper editor. And no wonder he was picking at my stuff, you know.
Going over it with a fine tooth.
Oh, he was. And something happened one day. They represented the insurance companies. Well, he had this brief on his desk. And I said, have you read it? No. I said, why? Because the client won't pay for it. I'm not going to read it. I said, you're not going to read it? No. They won't pay for it. And so, you know, you had that. Now, I ended up trying cases with the best law firms in Nashville. I mean, opposite them and all.
You've always practiced solo pretty much?
I've always practiced solo. I mean, from 1978 on, I've practiced by myself.
Now, you have developed a great reputation within the Bar Association, especially helping prepare the memorial service.
Thank you.
Every November, and now also in late May, a memorial service honoring the Nashville
Attorneys
attorneys
who
that passed away within the previous year is held at Downtown Presbyterian Church. Tell us a little bit about how you got interested.
Well, I got into that through John Reynolds.
John Reynolds.
And John Reynolds, around 1995, told me, he says, you need to come to our meetings. Well, what I'd been doing up until that time, when I guess I was around 35 or 40, and I went down to Chattanooga. I'm the youngest of 3 children, and I had a brother named Mary Bers that was born in 1936 and died 2 days later on November 22nd, Friday, 1936. So I got to looking through Mother's desk in there, and here I found these little packet of letters, and they were in a blue ribbon, encased in a blue ribbon. And they were condolences letters that were written to my mother and daddy when their son died. Well, I started doing that to people. When I would see a name in the paper and stuff like that, I would write letters to people. And I remember I wrote one to Bill Willis when his mother died. And he wrote me a handwritten letter back talking about she was a school teacher over there and all. And I wrote to Miss Johnny, when Johnny Mize, the big cat, died. In Demorest, Georgia, I wrote, and here comes this letter back in this beautiful handwriting. And she said, well, David, said John wasn't one of the baseball players, he was a tennis player. And she told me about that. Well, so I got interested in it, and you draft the memorial resolutions. Well, I'm a voracious reader, especially of Red Smith. The sports writer. And so he has a book called To Absent Friends.
To Absent Friends.
And it's a book that after he was dead, his son compiled it, of his wittiest stories and things like that. Well, it's the way he writes and the way he talks, and so I've had an interest in it. And we had one fella, we laugh about it on the committee. We had a lawyer here in town that I couldn't find anybody to say anything nice about him. I mean, you couldn't. So, but he had his children, so I contacted his children. I said, I'll tell you what, we're going to do it up good for your daddy. We want you to come. And I had to make up this thing. But where I came up with that idea was Toots Shore. And when Joe Page, now you're not old enough to remember this, but Joe Page was one of the first fireballers, as they said, he threw smoke in 1947.
Pitcher for
the Yankees. Well, he, and as Red Smith wrote, by 1950, the smoke was off of Page's fastball. And they sent him down to Newark. Well, he comes into Toots Shores one night.
This is a
famous Toots bar up there. And he said, Toots went over there and talked to him. He came back and said, I gave him a hero's welcome. And all.
So you gave a hero's.
I gave this boy a hero's thing,
You have done a whole lot for the Bar Association, and especially on the memorial service.
Thank you.
Presently, you're the chair of the historical committee. That is a terrific committee to be on.
It is. You're on it, and we're all. And it's one of the most interesting committees. That and plus the memorial service, because we're talking about history. What happened to the. And there's so many colorful lawyers who were long before me, Cecil Brandsetter, Jack Norman, all of them, and you preserve that history.
Yeah, well, that's what we're doing right now.
What we're doing right now.
Part of the historical committee's mission, and this is something we've been doing now for 4 or 5 years, is recording videos of interviews. So really appreciate it. And,
I'm glad to.
Is there anything else you wish I'd asked that I've forgotten, and would you like to tell us?
Well, so many things have happened to me, Paul. When you get started backwards like you do, and I thought when I got fired from that first law job that it was the worst thing, and I wouldn't tell anybody for 9 years before I told anybody what had happened to me. But it turned out it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Turned out to be a real blessing.
Because there were things I had to do. I had to grow up. I grew up a very sheltered life, and when you grow up that way, you are in for a rude awakening. So now, when my son heads up all the civil enforcement EPA. He's out in Denver.
What's his name?
David Jr.
By the way, you have a daughter?
I have a daughter named Deborah who lives down here in Brentwood. She is with First State Bank. David's 47 and Deborah's 44. And so David and Deborah both went to Lipscomb. And then David went to Johns Hopkins. and in environmental engineering. But there's one thing I told him. I said, something that helped me. I said, son, you need to get out and get your nose blooded. That's the best thing you can do. And so he went to work for the government. He's still with the EPA. He's been all those years with them. And Paul Rand Dixon came over to Lipscomb when I was a student there, and he was talking to us, says, you fellas, you want to go to law school, come to work for me at the FTC, and I'll get your nose blooded real quick.
Well, that's right. That's right.
And so,
well, thank you so much.
You're
My
welcome.
final question to you is, how would you most like to be remembered, or what accomplishment are you most satisfied with?
I can remember seeing the statue, the bust of Grafton Green in the Supreme Court building. And I used to know it by heart, but you know, a scholar, an upright man.
Yes.
And what you want to be is that you were a good person, that you were good to people. And you know, there's a whole lot more power than in being able to give. When somebody has a problem, when you want to help somebody like that, you know, it doesn't take much to be a jerk, but you can be, you know, it's sort of like a governor. The power to forgive is a lot stronger. A judge doesn't have the power a governor has, right, to grant clemency. But I would like to remember that I was honest and truthful. And my wife tells me sometimes that, David, you're too truthful. I mean, you know, you just go ahead and tell it, and
Perhaps your nickname, the Curmudgeon.
Curmudgeon,
Now that's a badge of honor you should wear.
Well, it is, and you know where that came from. Ed Yarborough.
He gave you that.
He gave me the name the Curmudgeon, and so I signed my stuff now HC, just HC is head Curmudgeon.
Well, you certainly are that, but more importantly, you're honest and truthful, and a real credit to our profession.
Well, thank you.
And thank you so much
for
meeting with us today.
I've enjoyed this.
All right.